Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Catherine O'Lean, Programs Manager at the American Library in Paris. For those of you who are just discovering us, we are the largest English language lending library on the European continent. That's something we're incredibly proud of, but we're also more than that. We're a vibrant cultural and cultural event space as well. So normally we host at least 2 events per week for adults, as well as many, many more for children. Right now, we're obviously limited to Zoom so that we can stay safe. So thank you for making that leap with us. We've been doing this for, I think, 10 months or so now, and it's been wonderful that you've all continued to engage with us in that way. And also, I think we have the chance to welcome many of you from the States, which we wouldn't traditionally get to do. So it's lovely to see you tonight. The American Library is also an independent nonprofit institution. We don't receive government funding from either the French or American governments, but rather we rely on the generosity of our donors and the library members as well. So thank you to those of you in the audience who are our supporters. We appreciate it very, very much. You can learn more about us on our homepage. We also post on sort of all the socials. We have a YouTube channel where you can find our past programs. We have a Twitter account. We have an Instagram, a Facebook. So anywhere you'd like to learn more about us, you can definitely do so. Tonight, I am delighted to be welcoming Suzanne Nossel in conversation with Michelle Kuo. I'll go ahead and introduce both of our speakers and then hand it over to Michelle for the interview. So Suzanne Nossel is Chief Executive Officer at PEN America and author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, about which she'll be telling us tonight. Prior to joining PEN America, she served as the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch and as Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. She has served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, leading US engagement in the UN and multilateral institutions on human rights issues, and in the Clinton administration as Deputy to the US Ambassador for UN Management and Reform. Suzanne is a featured columnist for Foreign Policy magazine and has published op-eds in the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times, as well as scholarly articles in Foreign Affairs, Dissent, and Democracy, among others. Michelle Kuo is the author of Reading with Patrick, runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the Goddard Riverside Book for Social Justice. She has worked as a lawyer for undocumented immigrants and incarcerated people. Michelle has written for the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Public Books, Los Angeles Review of Books, The Point, and other publications. Currently, she is an associate professor of history, law, and society at the American University of Paris, where she works closely with students on issues of social justice. So welcome to you both, and thank you so much, Michelle, for accepting to be my co-host tonight and to take care of this interview. It's wonderful to have you both.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's such an honor. Thank you for organizing this. I'm just always delighted by the program that Catherine organizes for all of us, and I look forward to hearing all of the audience questions. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you, Suzanne. I loved your book. I thought it was gutsy, nuanced, and compassionate. I thought it was an important book for our times where free speech is so politicized and where we live in such divided, such a divided culture. And I think your book is admirable because it tackles these issues head on without hedging and hiding. I just wanted to ask you first to start by sketching out the generational differences, which are so stark to me as a teacher. In just the past 7 years I've been teaching at a university, I've seen a huge shift in how students think about free speech. And as you write in your book, researchers surveying Gen Z, quote, "We're startled to discover a dramatic shift in attitudes during this time towards wider support for censorship and far lower priority on free expression relative to social justice concerns." Could you start by describing some of these generational differences for us, and then also talk about what you think of this broader support from Gen Z for censorship? Where is this coming from, and what is your take on it?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me and for organizing this, and to Stacy Keith, my former colleague, for reaching out and getting in touch with me and helping to facilitate. It's great to see everybody here. I wish I were visiting you in Paris, but this is second best. So yeah, well, the generational differences really were an important part of the impetus for the book. At Penn America, which is, you'd think of as the American branch of Penn, but we're a nonprofit here in the US with a mission to celebrate and defend freedom of expression, and an organization of writers that is in federation with other Penn centers all over the world. So I'd say about 5 or 6 years ago, we began to be concerned about what we were seeing on university campuses. And it was sort of these manifestations of censoriousness. There were a series of incidents I talk about in the book. At Yale University, a huge uproar that originated with a memorandum that the university circulated telling students what Halloween costumes were appropriate and which ones might cause offense. So if you wore a Mexican sombrero, that could be offensive. If you dressed as a Japanese in a traditional kind of geisha costume, that could be offensive. And they were sort of putting people on notice, including people come from all sorts of backgrounds all over the United States and the world who might not know how this attire might be received by other students. And there was an administrator who issued a memo very strongly criticizing that guidance and saying this was infantilizing students, and that students who had actually requested that the memo be distributed were wrongly ceding autonomy and agency to the authorities in the university, and this should be something that should be worked out between students. And she was actually a child development specialist, an expert, and she drew on that professional knowledge to frame her position. But it absolutely blew up, and there was a huge uproar and ferocious backlash against that critical memo. And it ended up that the scholar who wrote it and her husband had to pull back from being deans of a residential college at Yale. And they're still, I would say, affected by the harshness of the vitriol that they experienced both on social media and in person live. There are videos of students screaming at them saying this memo should never have been written. And that's just one of many examples. There have been examples at Middlebury College with a speech by Charles Murray erupting into violence, a major conflagration at the University of California, Berkeley over a kind of right-wing firebrand who visited the campus a couple of times. And, I'd say simmering fires on many dozens of other campuses. And so we at Penn America sort of decided we were going to look into this in some detail, because we hadn't seen this in recent years, or really ever. And we wanted to know what was behind it. And there were also other demands and issues that you may have heard about, so-called trigger warning. So the idea that if there is material on a syllabus, let's say about rape or domestic violence, that students should be warned ahead of time that this could trigger an emotional reaction. It could unleash echoes of a traumatic experience, and that students needed to be put on notice so that if this was going to be upsetting for them, they could take action, be prepared, maybe not attend class that day. And so this idea that professors should be going through their syllabus and sort of marking potential triggers became one object of controversy. There's also a big debate over whether the campus should be considered a so-called safe space. Should it be a place where all students, regardless of their background, ought to feel protected in the sense that nothing upsetting or offensive is going to happen because that's out of bounds. And this is, kind of like a home environment for you. So we undertook to look into all of this, and we produced a big report called End Campus for All. And I would say, what we found is this, and it's not necessarily what you might expect from a free expression organization. I'd say overwhelmingly, when you look into, well, why is it that students are asking for trigger warnings, or why do they want safe spaces? I think it has to do with the drive, which now has sort of been turbocharged this past year in 2020, since the racial justice protests that took place here last summer, to try to dismantle the lingering legacy of racism and bigotry in this country. And there's a recognition that, much as great progress has been made, the victories of the civil rights movement, more diversity in many realms, that there are stubborn, revanchist, and really cruel and harsh and denigrating strains of racism that are persistent and pervasive throughout our society. And a rising generation of young people, I think, looks at this differently, and they really believe it is their work to try to eradicate this. And when they call for things or act in ways that impinge upon free speech or venture into censoriousness, whether that's calling for a punishment for an offense or asking for a trigger warning or for a campus to be a safe space, I think it's not because they are necessarily against free speech, but rather because they don't know much about free speech. They don't appreciate free speech. They don't see why free speech is relevant to the causes that they are invested in. And they feel if it's a choice between protecting someone from harm, making the campus more equal and inclusive, allowing everyone to feel secure and have a sense of belonging, that should trump over free speech protections. And I wonder if we're now allowed to start using the word Trump again without the association. It's probably a little early, but eventually we're going to get there. So in the book, what I really set out to do is make an argument that both the college campus and our society can drive forward to new levels of equality and inclusion, and that is something we need to do, and it's something I believe in very strongly, but that it need not and should not come at the expense of freedom of expression, academic freedom. And so I really try to set out in 20 specific principles how these ideas can be reconciled.
And I thought your principles were so clear, and that they honored the Gen Z's passion for social justice and attention to the failure of Reconstruction and the promises of the civil rights movement. But I wonder if we can zero in on what you said about this question of campus as a safe space. I was really interested in your section in your book where you talked about teaching the N-word, as well as your sections about how 81% of students say that words are a form of violence. I wonder what advice you could give to teachers like me, for instance, who might have classic books on our syllabus that are now deemed offensive and that contain the N-word. At University of Michigan, there was just recently a big controversy about whether it should have been read from a story of Faulkner. What advice would you give us in this situation?
Yeah, look, I mean, this has become a huge flashpoint. I don't know what kind of play this incident got in France, but there was just a case at the New York Times just at the end of last week, where a longstanding reporter had a 40-year career at the New York Times, was at the forefront of their coverage of the COVID pandemic. He had, during a trip with students in the summer of 2019, used the N-word and spoken it aloud in front of these students when talking about, he was asked a question about whether child should have been disciplined for posting a video of herself saying the word, and sort of asking about the circumstances of that video. Was she referencing literature? Was she repeating a rap song? Was she actually using it as a slur? He spoke the word aloud, and this incident was investigated. The Times first concluded there was no malicious intent, and they reprimanded him, and sort of that was that. But then it blew up again as the incident became public, and the Times reconsidered and put out a statement saying intent doesn't matter, when your words have a harmful impact. And we actually at Penn America issued a statement in response, because I found that really, based on the book, very troubling. I mean, it kind of implicated a lot of different principles that I talk about in the book. And I referenced a few of them in our statement. And if I get a second, I'll put it in the chat so folks can have a look at it. But but the first principle I talk about in the book is conscientiousness with language, and the idea that when you're living in a diverse society, racially diverse, diverse in terms of gender, people of different ages, together in our public discourse, that it behooves you, and I believe it's an obligation of citizenship to be conscious of how your words are going to affect others. One of the big issues right now here in the US is our non-binary pronouns for people who want to be known not as she, her, or he, him, but as they, them. And for a lot of people, this is unfamiliar. They've sort of spoken their whole life in a certain way about other people. And this sounds ungrammatical, uncomfortable on the tongue. And yet, this is about people's identity. And, I talk about, what it was that helped me understand why, even though, initially I too had some resistance to these terms, why it really was the right thing and a show of respect to use them for people who want to be known in that way. So I have this principle of conscientiousness with language. I also have a principle in the book about the duty of care. So if you're in a position of authority, which this journalist from the New York Times was, he was on this trip kind of as a notable expert. Part of the attraction of the trip is you get to travel around with Times journalists. And so I think you even have an added obligation in that case to be conscious of your choice of words, who's listening. But I also have a very important chapter devoted to the importance of taking into account intent and context when evaluating the import of speech. And so when I saw the New York Times saying intent didn't matter, I found that really sort of troubling, because I think that's a sort of dangerous principle, especially in such a diverse world with people from all kinds of backgrounds, who may or may not know the meaning of the word that they're using. They may not know how it's construed in certain circles. They may not know how cultural differences, may put a different lens on it. And so I believe strongly you always have to take intent and context into account in evaluating speech. And so, when it comes to your question of the N-word, how should you think about this in a literature class? Of course, there are books like, the James Baldwin uses the word, it's in Mark Twain, it's novels. I think it can be done. And I've heard a lot of stories about, reading these books and just, sort of, it is a bit of a kind of a trigger warning moment. What we say about trigger warnings at Penn is not that they're always wrong, that there's anything, necessarily bad about alerting people ahead of time to material that may be disturbing, but rather that the university shouldn't dictate that it's something that an individual professor or instructor should decide on themselves. I think if look, this word could cause a very negative reaction, if you sort of just put it on the table ahead of time and say, we're going to read this novel, it's a terrific piece of literature, here's why, I like to have it on my syllabus, but it does have some language that may, is considered incendiary, unacceptable, classic slur. You can have them read something about it. And so I want to, let people know ahead of time, this is coming. This is not anybody in the classroom using the slur or legitimizing the slur, but, we are going to read this book. And if you have thoughts, and you want to discuss it, we're open to that. And, I've heard of instances where that is done and it goes very smoothly and it's just very clear. The context and the intent is made very clear. And then, the potential for sort of misinterpreting the presence of the word and an outside reaction is minimized.
I absolutely agree with you that intent does matter, and it does seem really troubling to me when people argue that it doesn't. That because how else are we supposed to interact and learn about one another, especially when we're so diverse? And so you make this pretty compelling case, and I was quite struck by it in your chapter about people who are socially reviled. So people, for those who remember, there was a video caught of an attorney named Aaron Schlossberg who was threatening deli workers and saying he would call ICE on them. So there was another incident of a person who posted something on social media about how she was headed to Africa and she hoped she wouldn't catch AIDS. And I liked how in your writing you took the gutsy move of expressing empathy for them and describing the process of the social shaming as a kind of punitive ritual and as a flogging. And I guess my question is, how do we distinguish from callouts that are legitimate and illegitimate? Like in the case of the Harper's letter of people, for some background, there were many prominent writers and scholars who wrote a letter published in Harper's stating the dangerousness of cancel culture. And in some cases, it seems like there's a rear guard of powerful people who are afraid of being canceled. And on the other hand, there are people who are quote unquote first-time offenders who become the targets of an online mob. How do we know? I guess there's two questions here. How do we know how to distinguish from a good call out and a bad call out? And second, how do we know that people defending against call out culture aren't just defending their power?
Yeah, I mean, really important questions. And I talk in the book about, when a call out is warranted, because I think there are definitely circumstances where someone does something that is offensive or objectionable or noxious, and it's important to say so publicly. And that, I give criteria for when I think you should call out, and when I think it may be more appropriate to, what I call calling in. It's not an original coinage, but calling in is just, approaching someone privately, which we all do. You sort of give someone a nudge, you pull someone into the kitchen, you send them a private email or you use the private chat on Zoom to tell them, oh, they might want to dial something back, or they may have said something that's upsetting, or, the language that they've chosen may not land well. And so, some of the criteria that I talk about are, how receptive do you think the person is? And, that goes to intent. Is this, sort of something unintentional where someone is using an outdated term? I mean, I talk about, when my mother, had to be told not to use the term Oriental anymore. And she was sort of like, what do you mean? I can't use Oriental. I've used this my whole life.
The funny thing is, by the way, is my dad still uses that word, and my brother to like, Dad, he's like, I'm allowed to.
Yeah,
everybody use that word in their generation.
Right, and whatever he's allowed to, and nobody would ever call him out for doing that. But for her, she sort of had to be told, but doing it privately, like she didn't mean anything wrong. She just kind of hadn't gotten with the times that this word was no longer acceptable. And so, some people look at the N-word controversy in the same way. And, there's something called the use mention distinction. Using the slur is one thing. If someone uses it in anger or to demean someone, but mentioning, this has been a notorious word. This is, a word that means X, Y, and Z, was seen as something quite different. And so there's scholars who are still to this day, in response to the New York Times incidents, kind of talking about this use mention distinction, when, in the reality, and I think, it is driven by a generational change, is that distinction is really broken down in the minds of young people. And, we've had many incidents on campuses of, sort of these unwitting professors who still kind of think it's okay, and they haven't gotten the memo that young people don't abide the use mention distinction, and even the mention is seen as something equivalent to the slur. And so I sort of think in that case, you really want to let people, try to let people know and make sure the word is out. And then there are people who sort of resist it. There's a kind of equivalent, I have a legal background. I don't know if anyone else on the call does, but you have the idea of negligence in tort law, where it's not an intentional offense. You're not hitting someone over the head willfully with a baseball bat, but maybe you're kind of swinging the bat around a little bit willy-nilly, and you accidentally whack someone. That's negligence. And that, I think, is a principle that sort of operates with speech, where people are, they're either a little bit kind of willfully resistant to using certain terms, or they're oblivious, or they're kind of loose and essentially not conscientious with language. And those can be some of the tough cases when it comes to a call out, because or canceling someone. And some people are saying that about this New York Times case, that this is sort of an older man who was used to saying whatever he wanted and, never really plugged into how mores are changing. I think that's a hard, I don't like to see someone necessarily punished for that. I think you need a higher standard of intent. And I think you are right with something like the Harper's letter. There's sort of a generation of people who are worried about, wow, if you went through their writings, and it's happening right now at this Times reporter, people are going back to stories he did, about the Haiti earthquake and saying, well, he blames the victim here, different critiques. And, the fact is, when someone has a long career of speaking and writing, there are going to be things that, don't necessarily sound perfect in retrospect. And there is an evolution in how we think about and talk about all sorts of issues. And so if you put that present day lens, we had an event the other day about Eleanor Roosevelt. And, one of the controversies in this new biography is like when she used the word darky, to describe someone who had worked for her family. And it was actually seen as extremely offensive and objectionable at the time. And she, kind of made a sort of half-cocked apology for it. But, would we now sort of take her, there's a big statue of Eleanor Roosevelt right near my apartment. Is someone going to say we should take down that statue, because she used that word? And so, I think that's one of the questions that comes up is sort of, using the lens of present day mores. That said, I also think it's important. Some people would say with the nword that kind of 20 or 15 years ago, this was okay. I'm not sure it was okay. I think if you said it, and it's come up in the context of a law school class where there's a professor who sort of uses it to illustrate the doctrine of fighting words, and a word that can elicit a really outsized and impassioned and even violent reaction. And he was sort of used to doing this for many years. And then all of a sudden he got into really hot water. And, if you ask, well, why didn't that happen 15 years ago? I think part of it was probably the classroom was less diverse. Part of it was probably that if there were students who, Black students who were particularly offended, they may not have felt like they could speak up, they were always in the minority. And it may have been very hard to voice how you felt about hearing a word like that. And so I think that has to, all these factors in my mind sort of have to be taken into account. I'd say when it comes to cancel culture, the situation that bothers me the most is really when it's kind of an isolated incident and there's no evidence of malign intent, and yet the punishment is draconian. Because I just feel like none of us can really live in a world that's that unforgiving. And if we do, it will have a constraining effect on what all of us say, write, and do, because that one false move, could be a career ender. And I think that, to me, is going to risks really narrowing the scope of our debate.
I do agree with that, in part for a larger reason, which is that we want to promote a culture of forgiveness if we're going to move towards a country that doesn't deny parole systematically to incarcerated people, that doesn't lock people away in prison for minor offenses. How do we have to have a broader cultural shift, and I feel like it's all interconnected. And then also just to echo what you said, I think these intergenerational relations are so complicated. As a very filial Asian child, I do believe we should give the elderly the benefit of the doubt, But on to my next question. I have so many questions for you, and I know that we want to turn it over to the audience in 10 minutes. I was glad that you talked in your book about the difficulty, the double standard that tech companies have in terms of promoting wanting to protect their free speech at home, but complying with authoritarian repressive states such as China and obeying their censorship rules. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about that double standard, or about what you encounter at Penn America with free speech in countries such as China and Russia that have oppressed speech. And I was also, by the way, just happy to see shout out to Daryl Morey, the Houston Rockets manager, who had a pro Hong Kong tweet.
Yeah, I mean, look, when in trying to make the case about the value of free speech to young people, one of the arguments I make in the book is just take a look at, what things are like in these authoritarian countries. Like, if you like the idea, are attracted to the idea that we ought to give our government greater, wider discretion to police speech, here's what that looks like in a place like China or Hong Kong or Turkey or Iran or Russia. And we had a very vivid example of this Clubhouse app, having kind of opened up what seems like an amazing window for open and free discourse in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and people being able to talk to each other about all kinds of sensitive topics that are really really endanger people when they if they speak or write about them on the mainland and increasingly elsewhere. And yet they have this sort of window on Clubhouse with, it sounds like all these fascinating discussions. And now Beijing, the Chinese government has shut it down. And so, I think when it comes to the social media companies, they make the argument, and I think there's some basis to this, that they have to abide by local law in order to operate in jurisdictions around the world. That's why most of the major US social media platforms are not in China, because it's too restrictive. And they desperately want to be in the Chinese market. Google made a foray a couple of years ago about trying to go back in after having withdrawn. And we had done a big report on internet repression in China, and sort of, we're one of a number of organizations that very forcefully, said there's absolutely no way you can do this and maintain fealty to the free speech principles that you profess. I mean, as I deal with in the book, those free speech principles, themselves are often very much kind of contorted, honored in the breach, overlaid with all kinds of commercial and reputational considerations, subject to double standards. So it's very much imperfect. I mean, of course, social media platforms are not subject to the First Amendment, which only constrains the authority of government to impinge upon speech. So they have the freedom to shut down Donald Trump and whoever else they like. But as a reputational matter, and because they control such vast swaths of our public discourse, they've sort of undertaken to uphold free speech principles to varying degrees. It's definitely to a lesser degree than government. I mean, they have all kinds of categories of speech, elaborately defined, that they demote, delete, counts, bases for accounts to be suspended. And what we're really navigating now is sort of this tension between recognizing that the harms of speech online are something that I don't think we ever quite encountered in the physical world. And we've seen that just over the last year in terms of both political disinformation. I mean, President Trump is being tried as we speak for former President Trump for impeachment, because of lies and conspiracy theories that spread online. And so those harms are staring us in the face and have had devastating consequences. Same likewise in terms of impeding the COVID response here in the United States. And so weighing how you combat those harms and get them under control, without completely gutting the landscape for free speech on these powerful platforms where so much of our political discourse takes place.
Thanks for that. And I just have two last questions before I turn this over. First is about anti-Muslim prejudice, which you deal with in your opening pages, and then which obviously is a huge controversial question for PEN America. And for background for everybody, PEN America in 2015 awarded a Charlie Hebdo survivor, and it caused divisiveness. And I wonder if you have any reflections about that 6 years later, about the decision to award Charlie Hebdo this award. And just for context, in France, anti-Muslim prejudice, I'm sure, as you read, is on the rise. There's a really troubling Times report a month ago in which many teenage youth, including a 12-year-old, were arrested by France for failing to pay proper homage to Samuel Paty, who was killed. And I wonder, I'm just curious about the decision and the aftermath and your own reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about it at some length in the book, and it was definitely a learning experience. And we give out an award for courage in the exercise of free expression, and we decided to give it to the surviving staff of Charlie Hebdo. We made the decision, I think within a week or so of the attack, and then we were to present the award at a big gala dinner that we do every year in New York. And about 10 days before that event, a group of writers, American writers, told us they were boycotting this gala because they believed Charlie Hebdo was racist and that they didn't deserve an award. And it was, there were writers we really respected. And so it was sort of, it was jarring. And then they rallied a whole group of, I think 150 others who weren't necessarily going to come to the event, but who were nonetheless joining them in protest. And, we decided to hang tough and go forward with the award. We had to really articulate why we were giving it. We wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that explained our rationale and the idea that Charlie Hebdo, we thought was helping to keep free speech open for all of us by being willing to go where so few others would tread, and that there was a certain valor in doing that. And we also, I'd say, had to really probe into the question of whether they were Islamophobic or anti-Muslim. And so we ordered up a lot of Charlie Hebdo, back issues and started looking through them. And we were ultimately persuaded by the argument that they, this was a sort of, an equal opportunity satirical magazine that made fun of priests and rabbis and Hasidic Jews and political leaders and all sorts of figures of authority. And it wasn't just Muslims. At the same time, we realized, look, the position of these different groups, in French society varies. And so these attacks kind of have a different import, and the depiction of the image of Muhammad, is something that is unique in Muslim culture. I don't think there is an equivalent kind of taboo, among other religious groups. But we were gratified to have support from the head of the leading French. Now I'm going to blank on the name of it. The anti-racism organization, civil rights organization, who actually flew over from Paris to New York to attend the gala and speak at the gala and speak out in favor of this award. And so that felt good. At the same time, we did recognize that for some people, including some American Muslim writers, it was unsettling and uncomfortable. And even though, a probing examination of intent and context in in relation to Charlie Hebdo would lead you to the conclusion that they're not anti-Muslim, that there was so much on the surface that could lead to a conclusion otherwise, and that many people did feel, without doing necessarily that deep study, that they that they were being denigrating and demeaning. And so, and I remember reading about, there was a famous New Yorker cartoon cover that some people may remember during President Obama's 2008 campaign that depicted him and Michelle Obama as terrorists in the Oval Office, and with sort of like a bullets slung over their shoulder, and like an AK-47, and big afro and different things to sort of indicate maybe like Black Power terrorists. And it was satirical. The purpose of it, clearly by the cartoonist, was to skewer those who were accusing, former President Obama of being, a radical, and just making clear through this picture how ridiculous that was. And yet Michelle Obama said, it was still jarring and upsetting to her to see that cover. So, she got it that, this guy's like on my side. He's trying to go after my critics. And yet, that instinctive visceral reaction is kind of negative and one of hurt. And so I don't think one can completely dismiss that. And I think that's sort of the balance. I do think that if we're going to have a place for satire in our society, we need to be willing to kind of go into the interrogation and understand, what motives are at play, what the real message is, because, the efficacy of satire depends upon being able to kind of skate the line and push it close to the edge. If you don't have that sort of initial reaction of shock, the satire may not be very effective. And so, in the end, we felt good about giving the award. We had a couple of representatives of Charlie Hebdo who came to the US. I remember one, interesting moment with them. We went to Washington and we had a whole discussion with the Washington Post about laïcité, and they were, explaining how that principle works, and you'd never, wear a religious garment, out in public. You could do it in your own backyard. And then we went over to the White House for a meeting, and we were sort of, shuttled through, all these layers of security and bag check. And then when we finally got to be met by the person who was, the kind of special assistant to, for our meeting, she was, in a headscarf, working in the White House. And it was like completely normal, like nobody thinks twice. And, I felt sort of proud about that too, that, in our country, that's something that we can have, that nobody, thinks is out of place, and we sort of make it work. Do I still think we make it work? I hope so.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I want to make sure I give the audience members their shot at asking a question, even though I'm dying to ask you like 5 more questions, but it's okay. See, Catherine, I obeyed the time limit.
You did. You snuck it in just in time here. It's perfect timing to open it up to audience questions. But first of all, thank you both, Suzanne, for your generous responses, and Michelle for your wonderful questions. I do have one question that's already come in, but yes, again, just wanted to formally invite everybody to begin submitting their questions via the chat, and we'll get through as many as time allows. And Michelle, there may be time for you to get a few more questions in if we have very few audience questions. So let's dive right into it. The first one is going back to tech. So what about the double standards of tech companies at home? Hold on. In the debate about free speech, it seems like on the progressive side, we have to be extremely careful, to the point where it can be overly constraining and infantilizing, as you say. But on the other hand, on social media, there are no holds barred. Anything can be said, and in the sometimes threatening, shocking language, not all of which is addressed by shaming. How can we explain this disparity?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is sort of the nature of social media, and the fact that there are all sorts of, I think, ways in which we're hardwired as human beings when we engage with each other, particularly face to face, actually in person. I always feel like, that if you've got a sensitive situation, whether it's with a family member or colleague, you want to sit down with them. And that's because, that's how trust is built. That's how you're most attentive to the human responses to what you say. There's the most kind of interactive give and take in the communication. That becomes, I think it's more attenuated on Zoom, and it's ever more attenuated on social media. It's very easy to sort of forget that people on the receiving end of your trolling are actually human, and that there's somebody you might meet on the street or work with, or have a common friend with them. And so that ability to sort of abstract the person and to remove that element of kind of human empathy and having to look somebody in the eye and stand your ground that they are noxious and racist and bigoted, or whatever you're accusing them of, that it turns out that unleashes this kind of very vitriolic and kind of unconstrained, often hostility. We do a lot of work at PEN America on online harassment. Anonymity also makes it much worse, where someone can hide completely under a false name. And there are reasons we allow for anonymity online. And, you know, for us in our work as PEN America, it is very important for writers and activists in many parts of the world to be able to participate in social media anonymously and have that protection. But there is a real dark side, because it kind of, you know, it sort of brings out the worst in people. And this has actually been studied, you know, that people are, you know, much less sort of measured, that you know, sympathy and relatability and other qualities decline, you know, when we're in that removed social media context.
Great, thank you. So there's another one sort of along the same lines here. So let me begin. Free speech absolutist platforms that peddle extreme conspiracy theories and host mass shooter manifestos and spread fascism, they have an absolute right to try to exist, but right-thinking people have an absolute right to struggle to deplatform them. And then the person references 8chan. I guess this, I'm a little bit confused about the question. I wouldn't mind.
You know, I think it's a good question. I think I understand it.
Okay, please go ahead.
I do talk about this in the book. I mean, generally speaking, when it comes to the government, I make the argument that, you know, if someone is saying something objectionable and you reject it, it's generally better to object to what they're saying, but without calling into question their right to say it. And, you know, for example, there's actually an interesting example of this that just came up at Harvard Law School. There was a professor who just over the last week published this article. I don't know, Michelle, I don't know what, if this crossed your radar, but.
Oh, Jeannie Sookerson, yeah.
Yeah, it was, so the article was about like kind of Korean and Japanese comfort women and really calling into question whether they should be viewed as, you know, the victims of a grave human rights abuse, which I think, you know, how they are viewed. But his argument, I think, is that they were entering into volitional contracts for their work, and so that they had agency, and that this, you know, as a matter of contract law, you know, these comfort woman arrangements were, you know, really just fine. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, I haven't read his article. And this professor, Jeannie Sookerson at Harvard, sort of, you know, had this very thorough takedown of arguing that his sources were not reliable, that his theory was, you know, inconsistent with any reasonable notion of contract law and voluntariness. And, you know, she basically, you know, dismantles his argument piece by piece, you know, in a really effective laser-like way. But she never says, you know, this piece should be withdrawn. The journal, the journal should be pulped. You know, he should be fired from his position or disciplined. You know, she just takes him apart intellectually. And I think that, you know, in that realm, I think that's the right response. When it comes though, you know, I think that the question is harder when it comes to these platforms that, you know, ostensibly are open to any kind of free speech, and yet have become breeding grounds for, you know, the spread of disinformation, including on issues where, you know, they have real world consequences, whether that's, you know, false cures for the pandemic, or, you know, mass shooter manifestos, fascist content. And I think, you know, particularly where the platform makes no effort to mitigate those harms, you know, I think in that instance, to call for the dismantling or the disabling of the platform, you know, as happened with Parler in the wake of the Capitol insurrection, you know, that all of its sort of partners in Amazon, which was providing its servers, just said, we want no part of this. And, you know, it is sort of part of the free market system. But, you know, I also think there are instances where it can go too far. I mean, one situation we've gotten involved with at Penn is with Zoom, actually, where there's a woman who was associated with one of the Palestinian hijackings years ago, back in the 70s. And she was participating in some Zoom events, public events on campuses in the US, invited by different campus or student groups. And some groups began to protest Zoom, saying Zoom should not allow its platform to be used for these events. And in fact, Zoom withdrew the platform, and YouTube did as well. And it's just sort of this disturbing case. Like, even if this woman, I mean, I don't know much about what she's been doing for the last 30 years. It seems she was a terrorist, certainly in her earlier life, maybe still to this day. But to sort of single out one person and open the door to all kinds of protest groups coming after users of Zoom, or to suggest that everybody who wants to be on Zoom, which as you know, has become the equivalent of our absolute public utility, like the telephone or the internet service. It's something we need to engage and to do our work and to connect with others. I think that idea that they should be policing every voice on the platform is problematic. Just looking at the next question.
Yeah, you can see these two. Some of them are coming to everyone, some to me. Yeah, but maybe should we just take that quick one from Stacy, actually, who is the very kind woman and library volunteer who recommended you to us, of course. So thank you, Stacy. So she's wondering if you can just give the title of that editorial in the New York Times that you had talked about.
I'll look for it, Stacy, before we wrap up. I'll try to dig it up. I don't remember. It was by me and Andrew Solomon, and I have to Google it up. I'm laïcité.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read the next one so we preserve it for the recording too. Okay, here it is. I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on laïcité. My American feeling on the topic was challenged when I heard the story of a Muslim woman who worked for the government outside of France that found her right to not wear a headscarf was jeopardized at her job because socially she felt obligated to show her religiosity. What do you think about the argument that laïcité protects free speech?
Yeah, so this is a Muslim woman who was, say, representing France as a diplomat in maybe a Muslim country, and she came under pressure to wear a headscarf, and that laïcité could be a valid sort of defense. I mean, yeah, I can see that. I don't think anyone should be forced to wear a headscarf, and I don't really think anyone should be forced not to wear a headscarf. I do accept and credit the arguments that are made by feminists about, particularly in certain countries and cultures, that it's really not a volitional choice, that it's something that is imposed upon people, and that their agency is denied. And I think that is a huge problem. It's not so, I think there are a lot of situations, at least here in the US, where that's not the case, and someone is coming to their own decision on it. But yeah, I think there probably are certain circumstances, but that's a kind of a fairly unusual one, where you have someone who's working for the government, in that setting. So I think there are other situations, for example, women working for the government or as a teacher, in France, where their agency, the principal could deny their agency.
Great, thank you. Well, that looks like it as far as the audience questions. I don't know if any are going to kind of creep in here in the last few minutes, but either we could wrap up, or Michelle, I wanted to invite you to give you the chance maybe to ask one last question.
Sure. I had a question about the process of writing the book, whether you came to change your mind on any topics that you previously thought you had a firm opinion on, whether there's anything post turning in the draft to the publisher that you wish you had addressed. Yeah, go for it. Writerly regrets and reflections.
Yeah, I mean, not really. Although, I would say that the book came out last summer, and it was right after these, this period of really the country really being rocked by protests on racial justice issues, and kind of a shift in the mindset of our country on those issues that I think we now see reflected in the approach that the Biden administration is taking. And so I was sort of a little scared about whether, anything I wrote in the book was going to be read to sort of fail to take into account, the way in which our public debate had moved forward. It still kind of comes up as an issue, in these discussions of the N-word. Like, there is kind of definitely a flank that takes a zero tolerance approach to it. And, I obviously, that's not my approach, but I would say overall, probably, what was helpful in getting ahead of these issues was that we were doing so much work with young people. And so, I had the chance to talk to a lot of, people from the generation, that is increasingly influencing these debates. And so I was able to kind of bake that into my thinking.
I guess I do have one final question, which is related, if you don't mind, Catherine. So the title is Dare to Speak. I know many of us are afraid of saying the wrong thing in these times, of getting canceled. Half the time I'm with my students, I'm like, don't cancel me for saying this, but I would like to venture to offer. I wonder if you have any advice for all of us in these dangerous times, and do you ever get scared of getting canceled?
I do. I mean, I do. I do. I think it's human, and it's natural, and it's hard to step out there. And my book is really, I mean, my advice is almost like the whole book, in the sense of, here is, and I have specific chapters on how to voice controversial ideas, how to protest something without silencing it. And so, I hope it can, and the overarching message is dare to speak, that, I hope people will speak out. I think there are ways to do it where you can avoid, at least inadvertently, blundering into something that you didn't mean. The harder thing is, when you're actually going to take a position that not everybody's going to like. And it's not because you don't realize that it may trouble people or they may object to it. That, but you believe it and you feel like it's worth saying. And, even speaking out about the New York Times thing is kind of that case. I knew some people would be unhappy. There were people, on all sides. Some people said, it wasn't strong enough. Some people said, why are you apologizing for this guy? And so, there is some risk, but I would say overall, in that case, it was largely civilized, reasonable. I didn't feel like I was trolled, or abused or berated. And, there's something also energizing about being in dialogue with other people and trying to, collectively puzzle through these issues. So I urge you to keep at it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great to see you all.
Yes, thank you both so much. I'll conclude with a few words about the library. But really, thank you to Suzanne Nossel and to Michelle Kuo for being here with us this evening and sharing your very insightful questions and perspective. This has been a really wonderful learning experience for all of us, I think. And Suzanne, I did see that you had shared the New York Times article in there in the chat that Stacy was wondering about. Yeah, it's a little bit up, so you'll have to scroll if you wanted to find that, but I wanted to alert people to that. Anyway, thank you also to our audience for being here and for your wonderful questions. It was a real pleasure to host you for the American Library in Paris this evening. I wanted to wrap up by reminding everybody that the American Library is a nonprofit organization and we do welcome donations. If that's something that you might be interested in doing, if you'd like to support the library, I invite you to click on the link that went out in the email with the Zoom link. It's just above it. That will lead you to a page where you can make a small donation to the library. Typically, it's about 10 euros per person per event that we welcome. So feel free to do that if you'd like. And otherwise, I hope to see many of you soon at another program. You can take a look at our calendar is pretty full for February and March, so you can kind of shop around and see what other events you might be interested in. And of course, I look forward to welcoming you in person when we're able to do that. I think we can dream about it at this point. We have to. So thank you again, Michelle, Suzanne. It was lovely to have you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye.
I'll see all your faces too.
Great to see you. Bye, Stacy.